Yeah, cosmic geography is a big deal in biblical thought, both in the Old and New Testament. And, the first service you asked about context. What does it mean to interpret the Bible in context? And I said, first thing we need to realize is that there are contexts, plural, to interpreting Scripture. And this is one of them. We kind of focused the last service, on worldview. It's very important that to read the Bible well, that you have the Israelite living in your head when you read the Old Testament. You have the first century Jew living in your head when you read the New Testament. Because that's the audience to whom Scripture was written. And so biblical writers will write things to their own audience who lived at the same time they did. Again, Scripture is written for us, but it wasn't written to us. And so our difficulty is sort of picking up and catching some of the things that the writer wants to communicate that to his original audience would have been sort of self-evident because they come from the same world. And cosmic geography is a big part of that. Now we know, the basics of, we have Israel. This is a people tied to a land. Okay, that's one element. But what really sort of starts this ball rolling is Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. And we all know the Tower of Babel story, but those two verses, I'll confess, I wasn't hit between the eyes by Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 until I was a doctoral student. Okay, I was not a newbie. I had taught Bible college. I had taught in Christian college. I had 2 master's degrees. And here I am as a doctoral student. And it was the first time I'd ever really looked at those verses and understood what they meant. And again, just to do it off the top of my head here, if we're using ESV, it'll say something like this. When the Most High, and again, we know who that is, that's God. When the Most High divided up the nations, again, we know when that happened, that's Babel. When he fixed the boundaries of the peoples, he did so according to the number of the sons of God. And then the next verse 9 says, but Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. And if we read through Deuteronomy, you'd see a lot of this allotment language, that the nations other than Israel are allotted to other gods. And it was the Most High who did this. And you say, that just sounds kind of bizarre. Well, their worldview was that by the time we reach Babel, we've had something go wrong in Genesis 3, the Garden of Eden, and God had to judge sin. We've had the flood event. God had to judge the sin of mankind because, according to Genesis 6:5, all the imaginations of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And now here we are on the other side. Noah's sons, they emerge, from the ark and they offer sacrifice. God repeats the original Edenic covenant to them. And it's going to be through Noah's sons that all the nations are going to ultimately derive from. But it's still one group of humanity. They still understand and acknowledge the true God. Haven't you ever wondered, well, how did we go from that to all these other pantheons? All these nations running around worshiping other gods. How do we get from right after the flood to all that chaotic mess? Because even Abraham's parents, his father was called a worshiper of other gods. How does that happen? Well, the answer is that it happens at Babel. So instead of dispersing, being fruitful and multiplying, God repeating the Genesis command, the people say, no, we'd rather congregate in one place and build this tower so that we can make a name for ourselves. And there's a whole lot that we talked about yesterday that is associated with that, but the tower, a ziggurat, was part of a temple complex. You built one to make the deity come to you. Okay, it's an inversion, the exact opposite of what God wanted them to do. And so God says, here we are again. And as a judgment, God says, okay, here's what we're going to do. You don't want me to be your God, evidently. You want somebody else to be your God? Well, let's see how that works. And God disinherits humanity. He divides up the nations. He divides the languages. He scatters them through the whole earth. And he allots them to lesser divine beings, lesser members of his heavenly host. Now, what they were supposed to do was be placeholders. They were supposed to rule the nations with justice because God still loves humanity. He doesn't write them off eternally, because what he's going to do is he's going to make a covenant with Abraham so that the nations will ultimately be brought back in and be blessed. But instead, what happens if we read Psalm 82 is that the gods of these nations become corrupt. They enslave their populations. They divide them. They fragment them. They make their lives miserable. And they turn the hearts of people to idolatry so that the people worship them instead. And that's actually where we get the other pantheons. Well, all of those nations then become tied to other gods. So the biblical worldview is this. From that moment on, God disinherits humanity, then he plucks one guy from one place, Abram. His wife can't have children, so she's perfect, because he's going to raise up a new family supernaturally, so that everyone who comes from that family will know the only reason I exist is because God actually did a miracle here.
Come on.
And then it's that family and Yahweh, their God, against the other nations and their gods. It's the whole history of the Old Testament extending from that one event, Babel. And it creates this cosmic geographical situation where all the other turf is under dominion of a rival, hostile, supernatural being. And we have spiritual warfare. This is where that term actually originates. It's the Old Testament roots of this idea. And it plays out in all sorts of interesting passages.